So today I'm going to be talking about the establishment and the early years of Weimar. That goes from 1918 to 1924, and it's the first module of the AQA A Level History course. So yes, let's get started. So first of all, let's look at the impact of war on Germany by 1918, so by the year the war officially ended. Well, Germany had a revolution and became this unstable democratic government. The stresses of the war led to a revolution in November 1918. This is also called the Revolution from Below and then the Revolution from Above. There's two of them. Well, many ex-soldiers and civilians hated these new democratic leaders and really believed that their fearless Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg had been betrayed by these weak new politicians. Although Germany was virtually bankrupt at this point, national income was 1/3 of what it had been before the war, of what it had been approximately in 1912. Also, industrial production was about 2/3 of what it had been, so like around 1913. The war also left 600,000 war widows and 2 million children without fathers. And by 1925, so just outside this period we're talking about 1/3 of the budget of Weimar Germany was just on pensions. So the war really deepened divisions in German society. There were huge gaps of living standards between the rich and the poor. And well, German workers were bitter because there had been more and more restrictions placed on their earnings, but the factory owners, they got richer. So the poor got poorer and the rich got richer. So that didn't add up. Also during the war, many women were called to the factories because the men were out fighting. But many people saw this as damaging to traditional values because women shouldn't work. Women should be at home taking care of the children, not out in the factories working. So yeah. So that was the impact of the war on Germany. So now let's look at Germany at the close of the First World War. Well, it was experiencing quite a bit of crisis. First of all, we have a military crisis. During the war, 2 million people died. And really, Germany's only hope of avoiding any further humiliation was signing an armistice. Hindenburg, Ludendorff, they were in the process of negotiating this. Well, Ludendorff wanted to surrender, and General Groener, he approached the Kaiser and said, "Hey, my army, we're not gonna fight for you." So the high command, Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and Groener, which represented the armed forces, would not help the Kaiser and were in disagreement with him. So yeah, the Kaiser did not have that much support left in Germany. Also, then part of the military crisis are the October reforms. So the revolution from above. Well, this was mainly Prince Max and Chancellor von Baden, and these were very prominent Weimar politicians at the time. They essentially put the armed forces in control of the civil government. And then we have Naval Mutiny. So kind of the revolution from below. So there was an order for ships from Wilhelmshaven, sorry for my pronunciation, to attack British ships. Now, two crews all did attack these British ships, but two crews just straight up refused. And also in Kiel, the sailors took over the base and just ceased operations. That is the military crisis. Now, social crisis, well, apart from the 2 million casualties in the war, 750,000 died from starvation, and 500,000 died from the Spanish flu, which started having an outbreak in 1918. And people just socially did not trust democracy. They had been living in autocracy for many, many years, and here comes this new system of government. Well, that doesn't look trustworthy. People just didn't like it. So then we have the economic crisis. Well, the banking sector was destroyed. They couldn't really produce basics, and factory workers, like I said before, they had restrictions put on their wages and what they could earn. But factory owners, these got richer. They benefited quite a lot from the war. And also, It didn't help that in 1919, reparations were made, like the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and it needs to pay £6.6 billion in reparations. So, and then we have the big one, the political crisis. So, 1918, the government was quite unstable. There was another strike at Friedrichshafen, and political parties were starting to form. The KPD, I think, emerged at this point, and NASDAQ either at this point or 1920, but Hitler was nowhere near NASDAQ at this point. It was Anton Drexler. Well, the SPD actually called a strike, and it was in order to get the Kaiser to actually abdicate. Scheidemann in Bavaria, Munich, he proclaimed a republic. Also, this new, Ebert, these people, they sent this peace note to Wilson. And this was, I think, before, I think it was before the Kaiser abdicated. And they said, okay, fine, can we just end the war? And in exchange, we would stop all submarine warfare, we would evacuate all occupied land, and we would try to democratize the political system. Now, Wilson didn't reply because he didn't want to, he didn't trust these Weimar politicians. Weimar, not Weimar yet, but these new democratic politicians. So what he did was just not reply. Then I think 3 weeks later, the new government was formed, the republic was proclaimed, and then Wilson accepted. And then, this was the republic was proclaimed on the 9th of November, 1918, and then on the 11th of November, the armistice was signed. So, yeah. Then the Kaiser actually abdicated, and this was formally declared publicly by Prince Max, funnily enough, before the Kaiser abdicated. And Prince Max immediately resigns and names Ebert to be Chancellor. He then holds elections and is formally voted as Chancellor. And then we have the Ebert-Groener Pact. First we have Ebert, who agreed to resist the soldiers' demands to democratize the army and stop a communist revolution. Groener, in exchange, would promise to give support to this new government by the army leadership. So it's the government will support the army if the army supports the government. And they signed this, and that was the actual pact. And that is it, of the state of Germany. So now we have the Weimar Constitution. This was being drafted in January 1919, and it's now called the Berlin Constitution for a reason. You'll see it later. Well, first we have universal voting rights. Now the strength in these were that it was equality based on gender, wealth, age, social class, and everyone could participate. Literally everyone could vote. It was one of the few truly universal suffrage available in the world. I don't think maybe New Zealand, or I don't know. It was one of the few countries. I think one of the first, if not the first European country to offer this. The weakness, however, was that extremists can get their way. Extremists could sway votes in their favor, and also uneducated people could get a vote. Then we have proportional representation. The strength was that everyone's vote counts. If you vote for a party and they get 15% of the votes, they have 15% of the seats. It was fair, and it included many parties. However, it included many parties, so it took ages to get a decision. Coalitions were made, which were extremely ineffective, and extremists, using universal suffrage, could get their way because they could influence people, and these people could vote for them and then put them into power. That's kind of how the Nazis got into power, essentially. Then we have emergency power, so Article 48. The strength it's rapid action, and it protects from threats, and it's close to what the Kaiser was doing before the government was democratized. It was comfortable. People were used to it. However, it concentrated a lot of power in the president, and he could be manipulated. Hitler, essentially, this is what Hitler does. And then we also have, in the Weimar Constitution, the establishment of undemocratic institutions. The strengths, they were there from before, they provided stability, and it was continuity, expertise. People who were there, they knew what they were doing. However, it's always biased and it always would favor the old elites rather than the new style of government. So, what is the impact of the war on Germany by 1918? So basically, essentially, what was the Treaty of Versailles? So this was signed in 1919, I think in July. I may be wrong, but I think it was July 1919, and it has 5 sets of terms. First of all, territorial losses, then reparations, then army restrictions, then the war guilt clause, and then the League of Nations. So let's start with territory losses. Well, the easternmost part of Germany, which was Prussia, would be cut off from the main part of the country. And this new part that was cut off was now the Polish corridor. Also, some territories would be allowed to hold plebiscites. If they wanted to remain part of Germany, they just had to vote for this. And if they didn't, well, they could vote no. Also, Alsace-Lorraine was given to France, as well as Ypres and Malmedy. These were given to Belgium. The Saar coalfields, which was Germany's industrial heartland, also like the Ruhr, but the Saar coalfields were a main part of Germany's industry. These were placed under the control of the League of Nations for 15 years. Then we have 75% of iron ore, 68% of zinc ore, 26% of coal, and overall 15% of all arable land was given to the Allies. The port city of Danzig was made a free city under the control of the League of Nations, and Memel was lost to Lithuania. All the overseas colonies from Germany were confiscated, and these were given to the Allies, but especially Britain and France, who loved their colonies. And then West Prussia and a part of Upper Silesia was confiscated and awarded to Poland, West Prussia being the Polish corridor. And overall, Germany was stripped of 13% of all its land and ended up losing 12% of its population. Which, if you're part of the German government, it hurts. Like losing population in the war, and like because of disease and famine, but also they're removed from your population. They're not killed, but they're no longer German. Then we have the issue of reparations. Well, Germany was really the only nation blamed for the war, and they had to accept this blame. And as a result, even though there were other treaties signed at the time with other losers, Germany was forced to bear the brunt of the reparations and was made to pay 6.6 billion pounds to the Allies. And also, most of the German shipping fleets, the railway locomotives, the rolling stock, and the patents, these were lost to the Allies. So Germany lost quite a big chunk of its economy. Also, they were imposed army restrictions. These included that they could never reunite with Austria to form a single nation. So they couldn't do Austro-Hungarian-German alliance. They couldn't do it. Hitler would go on to ignore this, but the Treaty of Versailles stated that they couldn't ally. But a lot of Austrians really believed themselves to be German. Most notably, Hitler. He was Austrian. Then the Kaiser and other notable World War I figures, they had to be put on trial. The Kaiser never attended his own trial, but they would put on trial without them being there. Also, the German Navy was limited to 15,000 sailors and 6 battleships. And the German army was forbidden from keeping any tanks, as well as being forced to demilitarize the Rhineland and for maintaining any submarines. Like the Navy was also you couldn't maintain any submarines or U-boats. The Rhineland, by the way, is this 50-kilometer strip of land that bordered France. So they couldn't use the land that bordered France, and they had to give away a land they had to give land to Poland that separated Prussia from the main part of Germany. Also, the German Air Force was completely dismantled. This affected people like Goering. And the German army was now limited to 100,000 men. 100,000 men. So then we have the war guilt clause. And I mentioned Germany was the only nation they had to accept blame for starting and prolonging the war. Now, the starting the war, that is totally not Germany. That was Austria-Hungary, because the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, he was killed in Serbia. and Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and Serbia accepted the declaration of war. And because Germany was an ally of Austria-Hungary, they came into the war. But Germany didn't start it. They were just pulled into it. They did prolong it, but they didn't start it. And they were forced to accept that they did, and this was under Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. Then the League of Nations, and along with this, Wilson's 14 points. But the League of Nations was established, but first of all, Germany was not allowed to actually join, and the United States never actually joined, and it was Wilson who proposed this, so that's that. And then, that is a peace settlement. So what are the attitudes towards this? So first of all, in Germany, they had to accept war guilt, but Germany didn't actually start the war. And throughout the entire war, the Germans were taught by the government that they had been winning. This helped promote the stab in the back myth, but anyway. Also, one of the 14 points of Wilson's 14 points was self-determination, but this wasn't really offered to many Germans because imagine living in the region of the Polish corridor. You would not be Polish, you would not be German. And if you felt German, you hadn't been offered this self-determination. So you were cheated out of that. Also, the reparations were too harsh, and the country, as I said before, was already struggling even before the treaty was signed. Also, Scheinemann's government dissolved because the ministers wanted to reject the treaty, but the cabinet and the SPD, they wanted to sign. Also, Hindenburg, Ebert, and Grenner were planning military action to stop things. And why this harsh treaty? Because they were already planning to stop the war. Why such harsh terms? Also, Bauer's government, they made the opponents state that the treaty was the treaty was patriotic, but a lot of people didn't feel that the treaty was patriotic. They felt cheated out of their self-determination, out of their lives, out of their money. And the SPD knew full well that the treaty would upset the German people. And they tried doing the policy of fulfillment, but it was quite successful in the end, but it wasn't popular. And also, those who had signed the treaty were called the November criminals, and they would be called the November criminals up until 1945, and it propagated the stab in the back myth. Also, it didn't help although Germans knew that the treaty would go on to be signed, and they already had an idea of it would be giving up in the peace note, and in the armistice. Some of the plans were, and the 14 points, they were made clear, but once the treaty was finalized, Germans were only given 6 days to actually sign. And then, what are the attitudes outside Germany? Well, first of all, Clemenceau, he wanted the reparations to be much higher. And, his argument was that if Germany had won the war, they would have demanded the same, terms that were just as harsh or even harsher. And you can prove this because in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with Russia in 1917, the terms were extremely harsh. So why should Germany get away with imposing these harsh terms on Russia, and we can't get away with pushing these harsh terms on them? People in France, actually, they went against Clemenceau when he came back because they felt the treaty was too lenient. After all, most of the fighting had occurred in France. And then the USA, they thought the treaty was extremely unfair, and they actually kicked Wilson. They didn't kick Wilson out of office, but he wasn't voted in again. And that is the reactions to the pre-settlement. So next, the economic and social issues facing Germany at the time. Well, first of all, let's look at the economic ones because those are the most significant ones. Well, first of all, we have reparations. Well, I already mentioned them, but the political impact is that they only had 6 days to sign the treaty with all the terms. It caused huge resentment, and politicians did try this policy of fulfillment. Economical impact obviously would be hyperinflation that would happen later on, increased debt, and well, their overseas colonies were confiscated, so they couldn't get money from there. And then the consequences were that they managed to get the installations postponed, the installments postponed of January and February 1922. Then they went back to paying, and in July of that same year, they asked for a postponement. And they were denied. And then in November, they went to the US and said, hey, can we have a loan of 500 million gold marks? And can we just stop payments for 3 years? We're going to continue paying you eventually, but we need to get our economy straight. And the French and the Belgians were like, okay, you want to stop paying? Fine. But we're going to invade the war. And this led to the war invasion. So it was on the 9th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops invaded the Ruhr. Because they were no longer able to pay reparations, so the French and the Belgians said, okay, we are going to extract these reparations from you. And 60,000 troops were sent. The government ordered a workers' strike using passive resistance, and it was actually really effective, up until one point where Stresemann did call for the end of passive resistance. And the consequences, well, hyperinflation was an immediate consequence of this. Well, most of the country's raw materials were locked in the Ruhr, and well, first of all, they were under the control of the French. But even if they managed to produce anything, that was under control of the French. But because of this policy of passive resistance, they weren't producing anything. And until they produced anything, the French wouldn't leave. So that was quite a few, it's a vicious circle. And there was a general shortage of goods and raw materials. So like I mentioned, this led to the hyperinflation crisis. Now, why print the money? Because they just said, okay, we're just going to print more money. Well, it was to make up for the increased money to pay the debts. They thought, okay, let's just print more money and then we can pay the debts. But of course, the value of money went down and prices shot up. Those who had jobs and savings, they lost all their money. It became worthless. And this led to increased resentment to the politicians and the rise of extremists. And if you, little anecdote, if you went to a coffee shop and you ordered coffee, you would have to pay for the coffee in advance. You couldn't pay for it after, because then the coffee would have tripled in value. So you had to pay triple what you would have had to pay if you just paid before. And then, to solve this, they introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark in October 1923 to limit the circulation of the Reichsmark, and then reintroduce the Reichsmarks. And this led to government collaboration with the USA in the Dawes Plan of 1924, but that's the next period of Weimar Germany. And that is economic instability. Now we have political instability, and this is really that was the economic side of Germany. Now this is social side. So we have three main revolts or pushes, and then assassinations, which is a different part. So first of all, let's look at the Spartacus revolt. It occurred from the 5th to the 12th of January 1919, right when the constitution was being written up, and Ebert was president. The government was set up in Berlin, and well, they were drafting the constitution and drafting the basis for this new style of government. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they were inspired by the Leninist Revolution. They belonged to the KPD. Rosa Luxemburg, fun fact, she was a woman and a Jew. Anyway, she was part of the Spartacus organization, Spartacus group, who were a radical part of the KPD, who were a radical part of the left wing of the political spectrum. So they were quite radical. They were the most radical out of all the radicals. However, it wasn't really well organized, and not a lot of people joined. 100,000 did, but compared to the population of Germany, that's nothing, and they didn't coordinate. The government effectively runs away. And where does it run off to? To Weimar, to finish the drafting of the constitution. And that's why it's called the Weimar Republic, the Weimar Constitution, because of this revolt, Well, the government was forced to move to escape to a safer place, not to fear for their own lives, but to safely draft this constitution, and they did. Well, they called the Freikorps to squash this revolt, and they used extreme violence to do so. Over 100 died, and including Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Karl Liebknecht is shot in the back when he was surrendering, and Rosa Luxemburg was shot and then thrown in a river. It didn't really help because it encouraged the Freikorps to use violence and tanks, uniforms, whatever, and face no consequences. So the Freikorps thought, hey, we could use this in the future. And also the Germans, who had just gotten out of the war a few months prior to this, literally 2 months prior to this, were now seeing tanks in the streets. So that was really scary for them. And now comes the Cap Push. On the 13th of March 1920, over a year after the Spartacus revolt took place. And it's organized by the Freikorps because they were motivated by the success of the Spartacus revolt. They belonged to Wolfgang Kapp's party, and this was of the right wing. So the Spartacus revolt was by the left wing, the Cap Push was by the right. And well, they wanted to destroy democracy because they did not like it. It was too liberal. Also didn't help that the government was a leftist government, and they were right wing. Well, they brought this weaponry into Berlin and used it to threaten people. The government, in turn, they fled again to Dresden and called for a general strike, which surprisingly worked because the people got together and did a general strike, which saved the Republic. I forgot to mention, the Freikorps are ex-soldiers, paramilitary group, which were quite angry with the Republic because, well, the army had been restricted to 100,000, so many people in the army had been left without a job. Well, Kapp was actually captured, but dies before he stands trial, and the government just displayed their weakness because for the second time in less than 2 years, when presented with a threat, they fled. They fled to another part of the country. And, well, if you thought that 100,000 Spartacus were a lot, well, only 12,000 Freikorps were involved. Yes, these had guns, tanks, uniforms, whatever, but it was just 12,000 people. And that is the Cap Push. Then, over a year and a half later, comes the Munich Push. It's like everything starts on the 8th of November. It's a quiet night in Munich, and von Kahr is addressing Lossow and Seisser and others in a Munich beer hall. Then around the beer hall, 600 stormtroopers, SA, they surround it, and in bursts Hitler and Goering. But at the same time, Rome went to the army barracks to try and take those. And this was the first prominent act the Nazis did. Hitler actually got into the Nazi party because after the war, the government sent him to try and look on extremist parties and see what they were saying and try to find out how to beat them. Hitler went to one of the meetings of NASDAQ and really agreed with whatever they said. So he thought, hey, I'm going to just stay here and not take notes for the government. Anyway, Hitler disrupts the meeting and took Kahr and Lossow hostage, and Seisser. He wanted to make a new government with Hitler as Führer and Ludendorff as Commander-in-Chief, which isn't the same thing. Commander-in-Chief means leader, like head of the army. Well, other stormtroopers, like I said, they tried to take control of the barracks with Rome, but they failed. Also, Himmler was there, and he was carrying the party banner. Hitler took, like I said, Kahr, Strasser, Lossow to the back room and threatened to kill them, and then kill themselves. Effectively saying, look at how radical I am, and also if you die, you'll die for nothing, because if you say no, I'm going to kill you, but also I'm going to kill myself, so you really don't get anything done, you don't get any justice, so I think you should agree. So they pledged their support reluctantly. Ludendorff eventually arrived, and Karl Lossow and Caesar publicly pledged their support. Hitler, I think he left to check out how the barracks were doing and left Ludendorff in charge. Now, Von Karl, Lossow, and Caesar, they approached Ludendorff and said, "Hey, we have wives. Can we go and visit them? They must be really worried. Please, can we just go to visit our wives?" And Ludendorff said, hey, fine, you can go. However, instead of going to visit their wives, they went to warn Ebert and the government, and they did. And on the next day, there was the plan to march on the Munich city center and take Munich. However, 2,000 men, led by Hitler and Ludendorff, they were linked in their arms. They had their elbows linked, I think is the name. And they marched into the city, but they were met by police and soldiers. They continued marching onwards, and 3 policemen and 16 Nazis died. Hitler's shoulder got dislocated, and this is because the guy who was next to him got shot and killed. And when he fell down, dropped dead, because they had their arms linked, Hitler did like that, so his shoulder was dislocated. Ludendorff continued marching on and got arrested, essentially saying, it wasn't me, that was just like, they made me do this, arrest me because I know I'm to blame, but it wasn't me. Hitler, as a consequence, he was captured 2 days later. Goering fled. I think Himmler also got away. And so Hitler and Hess, they were in prison, and Hitler was charged with 5 years. He had to serve 5 years. Ended up leaving the prison after 9 months, but whatever. And he was a huge castle. It has its own cell. He was with and Hess, and he could write stuff. Mein Kampf, for example, he wrote it in jail. Now, the party was banned from appearing in any political elections up until 1928, and Hitler was banned from publicly speaking until 1927. Now, fun fact, Goebbels, when he heard of this push, he wrote in his diary, "Oh, it's a push, but just a bunch of other nationalists." And during the time when the Nazi was banned, Goebbels spoke for Hitler. And Hitler kind of broke this agreement and spoke before 1927, but whatever. And then that's like the Munich Push, and then comes the political assassination. Well, not much to go on here, just 376 were killed, 254 were left-wing politicians, so killed by the right wing, and then the remaining, so 22 were right-wing politicians killed by the left wing. One of the left-wing politicians who were killed, most notably, is Walter Rathenau. Was killed in 1922, and he was a really notable politician as well as being a Jew. So that's that. And that is the first module. That is the establishment of the Weimar Republic. So yeah, that is pretty much it. I have nothing else to say, so yeah. Thank you for watching. Bye.